The destruction from nukes, from EMP, it's just so horrific. It's hard to describe zoo animals being caught in a nuclear blast and people throwing themselves into bodies of water instinctually because they're on fire and they're melting without sounding a little bit sick, like I just did, probably. And
Well, I'm interrupting for a second
Yeah.
because what I tried to do is not tried to do, what I did do is pull any scene I was writing from a factual text, right? So, for example, animals caught in a nuclear holocaust and bodies floating in a river in nuclear holocaust is sourced directly from survivor accounts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when you read those accounts, which you can, I sourced them all in my footnotes, you're like, oh my God, people jumping into the river because their burns aren't such that they're going to die, but their burns are, and they jump into the river and they realize they're floating down the river with a bunch of dead, burned bodies. That's, as you would say, very close to crass, but it's also factual. And it's also really powerful because it happened and it could happen.
You mentioned in the book that a lot of people would die of things like radiation poisoning and disease, and the description of that is quite gross as well. Like your blood won't coagulate, your intestines rupture, and you're essentially poisoned by the gut contents that you have. That was gnarly.
Again, sourced from facts. There was a guy called Louis Slotin, and this is like right after the end of the war. And he was a Manhattan Project scientist, and he was fed up with war, after the war ended. And I think it was 1946, and he's like, I'm done. I'm out of here. I don't want to be at Manhattan Project anymore. And they said, that's fine, but you have to train others. And so they were at this secret site outside of the Los Alamos laboratory. By the way, the Los Alamos laboratory was extraordinarily helpful with me. They gave me documents, photos, answered questions, really a sort of degree of transparency there that was pretty intense. And they helped me with the Slotin situation. So Slotin was asked to train, his replacements. And so he was in this secret site, Omega, and I say secret because it was kind of like off-site in case any accident happened. And they were doing this experiment called tickling the dragon's tail, where they were kind of moving around this plutonium sphere, and it dropped. And Slotin was hit by this dose of radiation that would kill him 9 days later. And the declassified account classified for a very long time. The declassified account of his hospital stay and then his autopsy is shocking. And I relay that in the book to show you this is what's going to happen.
It's a little bit like the show Chernobyl, where the firefighter is in that plastic sheet hospital bed. And I mean, it's worse because you're really describing it as opposed to us just seeing a burned guy in a hospital bed. But that's kind of what that guy was going through, right? In the show Chernobyl on HBO, if y'all have seen that. It's just really, really horrific. And that would happen to possibly hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, not just a couple of folks in a lab or that went to go fight a fire in a nuclear reactor. And that's part of what makes it so horrible is the scale of the thing. I know we're running a little bit short on time. I would love tell us, we covered a little bit about the United States system here, and we touched on other countries. What really kind of freaked me out was Russia's dead hand system. This seems like it could go really, really, really wrong.
And that speaks to the real problem here behind all of this, and you and I have touched upon this, which is paranoia, right? It's the old paranoia will destroy you, right? And the counterbalance to paranoia is communication. So the positive outcome of any of this is like get the leaders to communicate with one another, because paranoia leads in a really bad direction. And the dead hand, which you're referring to, which is also called the perimeter system, is built on the foundations of paranoia. The Soviet government was completely paranoid. Not entirely without reason when it comes to nuclear saber rattling. The United States definitely had its part in kind of, building up this narrative of like, we're going to get you if. And so, but the Soviet Union was terrified, we know this from declassified documents, of what was called a first strike, that the United States government would preemptively strike Russia to try to take out nuclear command and control, the Soviet nuclear command and control. And as a result, they created something called the dead hand. And that was this idea that if nuclear command and control were to be knocked out, and the Russians couldn't get at their, buttons, essentially, they couldn't get at their launch controls, they created a system, and again, this is reported by a Washington Post reporter named David Hoffman. He wrote a brilliant book called The Dead Hand. And this, what is actually known is really interesting versus a lot of what is thought to be known. But the thinking to be known, part of it comes down to that the Russians created the dead hand, which was essentially a AI system before AI, right? So they were using sensor technology to be able to, apparently they built a mechanized system that were the system to stop receiving verbal commands from nuclear command and control, stop receiving commands from humans. The system would be able to detect from seismic sensors nuclear bombs going off around Soviet Russia, and in response, launch all remaining Russian nuclear weapons without a human hand. Hence the dead hand.
It just seems like the worst idea. Like, we can only hope that they got rid of that, right? When the Soviet Union fell and all, because they don't even necessarily control all of those facilities anymore. I mean, that is just terrifying. That somebody could be digging somewhere and it's like, oh, we're just going to launch all these because this wire got hit by an excavator. I don't know.
Even worse, and I did not report this in the book because I couldn't get anyone to confirm it on the record with me, but there are now rumors that America, the Defense Department, is considering its own dead hand type system so that, we let the Russians know, hey, we have it too.
Mm. Oh my gosh. And you got to wonder who's crazy enough to do it. But I mean, North Korea has all those tunnels, right? The leaders can survive maybe for decades underground if needed. You got to hope they don't really want to do that. But we don't really know the state of mind of a lot of these people at any given moment. You have that Mad King hypothesis, right? Where the North hits us and then attacks the South. I mean, it just seems unlikely. But again, we're relying on somebody being a rational actor that is not backed into a corner.
And the worst attacks in history that happen are surprise attacks, Pearl Harbor, 9/11. And so again, this builds up this kind of chicken and egg scenario. Like, you have the Defense Department. We need stronger deterrence. We're about to revamp. We can't build new nuclear weapons per se, but on the table right now is the new building of the, upgraded nuclear weapon systems to the tune of, $1 trillion. And this idea that chicken or egg, we have to stay strong, is really something that I think is worth American citizens thinking about, being aware about, knowing about. Congress takes action based on what their constituents are rattling, them to do. If no one's paying attention to nuclear weapons, you can be sure the Defense Department still is.
Let's leave on a high note. Just kidding. Tell me about nuclear winter.
I mean, nuclear winter, again, a series of incredible interviews with Professor Brian Toon. He is one of the 5 original authors of the nuclear winter theory, which was published in the early 1980s, and one of the other 5 authors besides Toon was Carl Sagan, who was Toon's professor, okay? And Professor Toon has been working on this issue ever since. And cutting right to the quick of it, like, a lot of people are like, nuclear winter, wasn't that, or whatever word they want to use, and the answer is no, right? So initially, the Defense Department came out with this response of like, that's Soviet propaganda. And it wasn't. It's very real. It's very terrible. It's like, what happens is the nuclear blasts themselves do all this kind of damage to humans and infrastructure that we spoke of earlier. But on top of that, then what happens, which is even worse and kills more people, are the mega fires that ensue. And those mega fires loft soot into the air to the tune of billions of pounds of soot, okay? It's measured in like teragrams of soot. And that blots out the sun. And without the sun, there's no agriculture. And things freeze over. You know, bodies of water across America are covered in thick sheets of ice. Originally, the nuclear winter calculations based on kind of like pen, pencil, and calculator was that nuclear winter, the sun would be gone, 70% of the sun's rays would be gone for a year. Now, state-of-the-art climate modeling and computers as we have them, it demonstrates that it's actually a lot worse than was predicted in the 80s. Brian Toon was telling me that nuclear winter will likely last for 10 years. And places like Iowa and Ukraine, he used as an example, agricultural, bread baskets, will be frozen over for 10 years. There will be snow and ice. So without agriculture, people starve to death. And, then, I won't give you all the details, but of course, once the sun finally returns, the ozone layer has been so damaged that the sun is just, poisoning everyone who survived with radiation. And there are plagues and there are pathogens. And, what can really survive are the small-bodied animals like insects. And the bigger-bodied animals like humans begin to go extinct. And so Carl Sagan brought up that idea in the 80s when nuclear winter first became a thing, that the only people left will be those who have like these incredible prepper skills, which is not a lot of people. That's if you didn't die in the nuclear holocaust and you didn't freeze to death. So there's the pleasant ending.
Right. So you end up with these people who live in a bunker for 10 years if they didn't die of something like a blast, but then they have to survive the other survivors trying to find them. They have to survive diseases, which they can't really necessarily control. And just your own body breaking down. Like what happens if you have a heart attack in that bunker because, I don't know, you're not moving around enough or you're stressed, right? Like no one's coming to help you. There's no medical. It's just, and at that point, even if you make it through all that, then what? You come out and you've got this like locust infested, literally post-apocalyptic hellscape that you're living in but you can't go, you're getting too much UV. I mean, it's like, why? Why? That's why I was saying before, did researching this, initially I was like, did researching this make you want to become a doomsday prepper? I mean, I'm personally in camp, kill me first, right? So I don't have to deal with everything after the fact. That's where I'm at.
Yeah.